Nobody who entered Astraeus' cage had ever walked out the same way they walked in. The White Tiger's territory occupied the eastern wing of Bradley's estate, a sprawling enclosure with steel bars thick as a man's wrist, and a garden that bloomed with flowers no one dared to pick. Guards whispered stories during shift changes about the maintenance worker who'd lost 3 fingers trying to repair a damaged lock, about the intruder whose screams had echoed through the mansion for exactly 7 seconds before silence fell. The mansion itself rose from the hillside like a fortress built by someone who understood that true power required both elegance and absolute control. Marble columns supported archways that led to rooms most staff members had never entered, while security cameras tracked every angle except the one place where technology met its limit. Astraeus' domain remained unwatched because Bradley preferred some territories to exist beyond documentation, beyond the illusion that everything could be monitored and managed. Bradley had acquired Astraeus 5 years earlier from a collector who'd grown terrified of his own purchase, paying triple the asking price just to have the creature transported under cover of darkness. The tiger arrived in a reinforced truck with handlers who refused to make eye contact, men who'd dealt with exotic animals their entire careers but recognized something different in those ice-blue eyes. From the moment Astraeus emerged into his new territory, he'd ruled it with an authority that made even Bradley's most hardened associates uncomfortable. The animal didn't just occupy space. He claimed it with a presence that filled the air like electricity before a storm. His white fur gleamed under moonlight like polished bone, and his movements carried the fluid grace of something designed by nature to be perfectly lethal. Security protocols around the enclosure had evolved into an unspoken religion among the staff, rules passed down from veteran guards to nervous newcomers during their first week on the property. Never approach the cage alone, never make direct eye contact through the bars. Never assume the tiger's calm demeanor meant safety rather than patience. The head of security, a former Marine who'd served in 3 combat zones, had instituted a 20-foot perimeter that no one crossed without explicit permission. The tiger's daily routine followed patterns that seemed almost human in their consistency, as if Astraeus understood the value of predictable behavior in a household built on carefully managed chaos. He prowled the perimeter of his territory each morning at dawn, muscles rippling beneath white fur that caught the early light. Mid-afternoon found him lounging beneath the Japanese maple that dominated the enclosure's center, a position that offered both shade and an unobstructed view. At night, when the mansion's lights dimmed and most of the staff retired to their quarters, Astraeus would stand at the front of his cage and stare toward the main house with an intensity that made late-shift guards check their weapons twice. Something about those blue eyes in darkness suggested intelligence that went beyond animal instinct, a calculating awareness that made even armed men feel suddenly vulnerable and exposed. Bradley watched the tiger from his study window most evenings, a glass of whiskey in one hand, and his phone silenced on the desk beside him. The animal fascinated him in ways he'd never articulated to anyone, not because of its strength or beauty, but because of what it represented. Astraeus had never been tamed, never showed affection or sought approval, never compromised the essential wildness that made him both magnificent and terrifying. In a world where Bradley commanded loyalty through a combination of fear and financial incentive, the tiger's complete indifference to human authority felt almost refreshing. Astraeus owed him nothing, despite 5 years of perfect care, acknowledged no debt, despite the territory and freedom Bradley had provided. Their relationship existed in a strange equilibrium where Bradley held all the power, yet somehow remained the supplicant, standing at his window like a pilgrim seeking wisdom from an oracle. The mansion staff had learned to read Bradley's moods by observing his relationship with Astraeus, understanding that their boss's fascination with the animal reflected something deeper than simple ownership. On nights when business dealings went badly, or rival organizations tested boundaries, Bradley would stand at that study window for hours, watching the tiger pace and turn. The white tiger served as a barometer for tensions that Bradley never discussed openly, a living symbol of the violence that simmered beneath his carefully constructed exterior. The enclosure's garden had been designed by a landscape architect who'd been flown in from overseas and paid enough to ensure his silence about the project's unusual requirements. Native plants mixed with exotic species that could survive the climate, creating an environment that mimicked natural hunting grounds while remaining contained within reinforced walls. A small stream ran through the eastern section, fed by underground pipes that kept the water fresh and cold even during summer heat waves. Rock formations provided elevated vantage points where Astraeus could survey his territory like a king observing his domain, and the whole space was oriented to catch afternoon sun that would warm the stones where he liked to rest. What made the enclosure truly remarkable wasn't its size or expensive landscaping, but the fact that Bradley had never once entered it since the day Astraeus arrived. He'd commissioned its construction, approved every detail of its design, and spent a fortune maintaining it to standards that exceeded most luxury homes, yet the threshold remained uncrossed. His daughter, barely 3 years old, had asked once why the pretty white cat lived alone in such a big space. Bradley had simply said that some creatures needed kingdoms of their own, and the child had accepted this explanation with the easy grace of someone too young to understand that kingdoms were often indistinguishable from prisons. Guards rotated through various positions on the estate based on experience and reliability, but the assignment nearest Astraeus's enclosure always went to veterans who'd proven themselves capable of maintaining composure under pressure. These men understood that their primary responsibility wasn't protecting the household from the tiger, but protecting foolish visitors from their own curiosity. During the rare social gatherings Bradley hosted, security would establish a perimeter that kept guests away from the eastern wing entirely, explaining with polite firmness that certain areas remained off-limits. The tiger's feeding schedule followed a precise routine that never varied by more than 15 minutes, a consistency that reflected the household's broader obsession with predictable patterns and controlled variables. A specialized handler delivered fresh meat 3 times weekly, leaving it at a designated drop point before retreating to a safe distance. Astraeus would approach only after the handler had cleared the area completely, eating with the unhurried confidence of an apex predator who'd never had to compete for resources. Rumors about why Bradley kept such a dangerous animal circulated among staff members during breaks and shift changes. Theories ranging from exotic status symbol to elaborate security system to something darker that nobody wanted to name directly. Some believed the tiger represented Bradley's connection to overseas criminal organizations, a gift from associates whose operations extended into regions where such animals could still be acquired. Others thought Astraeus served as a test of loyalty, observing which staff members maintained proper respect for danger versus those who grew complacent around beauty. The enclosure's northern wall backed against a section of the property that bordered undeveloped woodland, creating an illusion that Astraeus's territory extended beyond its actual boundaries into wild spaces where human rules ceased to apply. Bradley had specifically requested this design element, wanting the tiger to see forests and open sky rather than just mansion walls and manicured lawns. It was a small concession to the animal's nature, an acknowledgement that even in captivity, some part of Astraeus needed to feel connected to spaces humans couldn't fully control. On clear nights, when the moon rose above the tree line and cast silver light across the enclosure, the white tiger would stand at the northern fence and stare into the darkness beyond, perfectly still, except for the slow movement of his breathing. These moments of stillness held more weight than his powerful movements during daylight hours, suggesting depths of awareness that made observers wonder what thoughts moved through a mind designed for hunting, yet trapped in artificial paradise. The championship game had reached its final quarter when rain began to fall, light at first, then gradually intensifying into a steady drizzle that misted the mansion's exterior lights and made the gardens shimmer like something from a half-remembered dream. Inside the central monitoring room, 5 security guards clustered around the main screen where heavily armored players collided in slow-motion replays. Their attention had narrowed to that single illuminated rectangle, professional vigilance temporarily sacrificed to the primal human need for spectacle and tribal victory. Madeline had been walking for 3 hours before she saw the lights of Bradley's estate, rising from the hillside like a constellation that had fallen to earth and decided to stay. Her clothes clung to her skin where the rain had soaked through, simple cotton that had been inexpensive, even when new and now carried the weight of water like penance. She'd left her apartment that morning with no destination in mind, just the restless certainty that staying still would suffocate something essential inside her chest. The neighborhood where she'd grown up had taught her that big houses on hills belonged to people who'd never noticed someone like her, invisible in the way that poverty makes people invisible to those who've never experienced its particular kind of erasure. But tonight something pulled her forward, an instinct she couldn't name that made her feet carry her up the winding private road toward gates that should have been locked. The rain fell harder, and she welcomed it, feeling the cold water wash away the accumulated grime of another week spent cleaning other people's spaces. The estate's main gate stood open by perhaps 2 feet, a gap that might have been intentional or might have been the result of a faulty sensor triggered by the storm. Madeline paused at the opening, aware that crossing this threshold meant trespassing on property where people like her existed only as service workers who entered through different doors at different hours. Yet her hand reached out and pushed the gate wider, and her legs carried her through before her mind could construct adequate arguments against the action. The driveway curved through landscaping that must have cost more than she'd earn in 5 years, every plant positioned with the kind of precision that money could buy when aesthetics mattered more than practicality. She walked past fountains that continued running despite the rain, past flower beds that bloomed in arrangements too perfect to be anything but professionally maintained. The mansion itself grew larger as she approached, its lit windows suggesting warmth and space in quantities she'd never personally experienced. Security protocols dictated that motion sensors should have alerted the monitoring room to her presence, but the guards' attention remained fixed on the game's final moments, where victory hung in perfect balance. Madeline moved through their blind spot like a ghost, visible only to cameras that no one was currently watching. The rain intensified, and she pulled her thin jacket tighter, knowing it provided no real protection, but needing the gesture anyway. She'd almost reached the mansion's rear entrance when she saw the enclosure, its steel bars catching light from floods that illuminated the space with artificial daylight. Something white moved behind those bars. Something massive that made her stop and stare despite the cold water, now running in rivulets down her face. The creature turned, and she saw eyes that glowed blue even from 50 feet away. An impossible color that seemed to burn with its own internal light. Madeline had grown up with her grandmother's stories about animals that carried more than just animal consciousness, creatures that existed on the border between the natural world and something older that humans had mostly forgotten. The old woman had been considered eccentric by neighbors who dismissed her tales as superstition mixed with early dementia. But Madeline remembered every word, every gesture, every warning about respecting the boundaries between human spaces and the territories that belonged to beings who operated according to different rules. The white tiger moved closer to the bars, and she found herself walking toward the enclosure as if pulled by invisible threads. Logic suggested she should run, should retreat back through the open gate, before someone noticed her trespassing on property that represented wealth and power so far beyond her experience. Instead, her feet carried her forward, rain-soaked shoes squelching against manicured grass that felt wrong beneath her soles, too soft and too perfect. Inside the monitoring room, one of the guards glanced at his secondary screen and frowned, noticing movement in a sector that should have been empty, but his team erupted in celebration as their favored team scored, and the momentary concern dissolved back into collective joy. The alert on his screen blinked twice, then cleared itself when the system detected no further motion in that zone, classifying Madeline's presence as a false positive, triggered by rain patterns and wind-blown debris. She reached the enclosure's entrance, a heavy door with a lock that looked like it could withstand military-grade assault. The rain fell harder, and she wiped water from her eyes, staring at the white tiger who now stood completely still, watching her with an intensity that should have triggered every survival instinct. Instead, she felt only curiosity, the same pull that had brought her up the hill and through the open gate. Her hand reached for the door handle, expecting it to be locked, finding it immovable as anticipated. She tried again, pulling harder, then noticed a secondary mechanism half hidden behind a decorative panel that most visitors would never think to check. Her grandmother's voice echoed in memory, words about how important things were often concealed in plain sight, protected not by obvious barriers, but by assumptions about what people would or wouldn't think to try. The mechanism yielded to pressure applied at a specific angle, and she heard something click deep within the door's framework. It swung inward with a whisper of well-oiled hinges, revealing the garden beyond where the white tiger stood like a statue carved from snow and moonlight. Madeline stepped through without hesitation, and the door closed behind her with a sound like finality, like the universe acknowledging that certain thresholds once crossed, redrew all the maps that came after. Astreus lowered his massive head, and a sound emerged from his chest that rattled through the wet air, a growl that carried 5 years of solitude and defensive fury. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth designed to crush bone and tear flesh, and his body shifted into a stance that preceded the killing strike. Every muscle tensed beneath white fur now darkened by rain, and his blue eyes fixed on Madeline with the focused intensity of a predator who'd identified prey. She should have frozen, should have retreated, should have done anything except continue walking forward through rain that fell harder inside the enclosure, as if the storm itself wanted to witness whatever came next. But her grandmother's voice spoke instructions in her memory, words in a language she barely remembered learning, and her hands moved in a gesture that looked like prayer, but served a different purpose entirely. The gesture came from traditions that predated modern understanding of animal behavior, rooted in times when humans and predators negotiated their relationships through respect rather than dominance. Her fingers formed shapes that carried meaning beyond language, acknowledgement of the tiger's sovereignty within his territory, and recognition that she entered not as conqueror, but as someone seeking permission from the space's rightful guardian. The movement took 3 seconds, and in those seconds, the distance between human and animal collapsed into something that existed outside typical categories. Astraeus's stance shifted, the killing tension draining from his muscles as his head tilted in a movement that suggested confusion mixed with recognition. The growl faded to silence, replaced by a sound almost like a question, a rumble that vibrated at a frequency Madeline felt in her chest rather than heard with her ears. She took another step forward, then another, until she stood close enough to see individual droplets of water clinging to his whiskers. Her palm extended slowly, offering her scent for inspection, maintaining the posture her grandmother had demonstrated decades ago in a kitchen that smelled of bread and old wood. The tiger's nose moved toward her hand, breathing in information that humans couldn't consciously process. Then his massive head lowered, and the top of his skull pressed against her palm with enough pressure to make her step back slightly, adjusting her balance to support the weight of his acknowledgement. Bradley had been reviewing quarterly reports in his study when Astraeus's roar cut through the mansion's expensive soundproofing, a sound that made the crystal decanter on his desk vibrate with sympathetic frequency. He'd heard that roar perhaps a dozen times in 5 years, always when something had seriously disturbed the tiger's territory or threatened his sense of security. The sound carried rage and warning in equal measure, and it meant that whatever had triggered it required immediate investigation. He moved toward the study's window out of instinct, expecting to see nothing unusual, perhaps a branch that had fallen near the enclosure, or a technical malfunction with the fence's electrical system. Instead, he saw his security door standing open, revealing the garden beyond where rain created silver curtains through the floodlights. And in that garden, he saw a figure that shouldn't exist, a young woman in soaked clothing standing impossibly close to Astraeus, her hand resting on the tiger's lowered head. The scene made no sense within any framework of reality Bradley had previously accepted, like watching gravity suddenly reverse itself or seeing water flow uphill. Astraeus didn't accept human touch, didn't tolerate proximity, didn't lower his defenses for anyone regardless of familiarity or intention. Yet this stranger had entered his territory, and somehow crossed every barrier that had kept trained handlers at bay for 5 years, standing in a position that should have preceded death, but instead looked almost peaceful. Bradley's hand moved toward the phone that connected directly to security, then stopped midway through the motion because calling guards would shatter whatever fragile equilibrium existed in that garden. The woman moved her hand slowly along Astraeus's skull, following the contours of bone beneath fur, and the tiger's eyes closed halfway in an expression that might have been pleasure or simply deep concentration. Rain continued falling, and the woman's dark hair clung to her face in strands that made her look younger than she probably was, vulnerable in ways that should have triggered predatory instincts, rather than whatever strange acceptance the tiger now displayed. He watched her lean forward and whisper something too quiet for him to hear, even if the window had been open, watched Astraeus's ears swivel to catch sounds meant only for him. The tiger's tail moved in a slow arc that suggested contentment rather than agitation, and his body settled into a relaxed posture that Bradley had only seen during those rare moments of deep sleep. The woman straightened, and for the first time since entering the enclosure, she looked toward the mansion's lit windows, her gaze moving across the facade until it found Bradley standing at his study window. Their eyes met across 50 feet of rain-soaked distance, and Bradley felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with knowing her identity, and everything to do with understanding that the universe had just rearranged itself, according to rules he didn't yet comprehend. She didn't look away, or show signs of fear at being caught trespassing, just held his gaze with the same calm she'd shown approaching Astraeus. Then she turned back to the tiger, and her hand resumed its slow movement through wet fur, tracing patterns that seemed to follow some internal rhythm only she could hear. Bradley descended the stairs from his study without conscious decision, his feet carrying him through halls he'd walked thousands of times while his mind struggled to process what his eyes had witnessed. The monitoring room guards remained focused on post-game analysis, unaware that their boss had left his office or that anything unusual was occurring in sectors they should have been watching. He moved through the mansion like a shadow, avoiding spaces where staff might intercept him with questions or concerns. The rain hit his face when he stepped outside, cold water that should have shocked him into reconsidering this approach, but instead felt cleansing, washing away the studied composure he maintained during business hours. He walked across the lawn toward the enclosure, each step carrying him closer to a scene that violated every assumption about safety and territory that had governed this household since Astraeus' arrival. The tiger's blue eyes tracked his approach, but the animal made no move to stand or assume defensive postures, seemingly content to remain where he was. Madeline turned as Bradley approached, and he saw her face clearly for the first time, young features that carried a peculiar combination of exhaustion and alertness. Her clothes marked her as someone from outside his usual social sphere, the kind of person he'd normally encounter only through intermediaries if he encountered them at all. Yet she stood in his tiger's enclosure, with her hand resting on Astraeus' head, like it was the most natural thing in the world, unbothered by the rain, or the dangerous animal, or the fact that she'd trespassed on property worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. He stopped 10 feet from the enclosure's open door, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to maintain the distance that protocol demanded. Words formed and dissolved in his mind. Questions about how she'd entered, why she'd approached the tiger, what gesture or technique had allowed her to bypass 5 years of carefully maintained aggression. But what emerged from his mouth was simpler, stripped of professional authority, and reduced to genuine confusion that overrode his usual need for control. The question hung in wet air between them while Astraeus watched with eyes that seemed to understand more than they should, a white tiger serving as witness to the moment when two completely separate worlds collided and discovered they shared unexpected common ground. Madeline's hand continued its slow movement through the tiger's fur, maintaining contact that appeared to ground her as effectively as it calmed the animal. She opened her mouth to respond, and Bradley leaned forward slightly, drawn toward whatever explanation she might offer for the impossible thing he'd just witnessed. But before she could speak, Astraeus lifted his head and released a sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a purr, something that vibrated at a frequency that made Bradley's chest ache with an emotion he couldn't immediately name. The tiger moved, his massive body shifting to position himself between Madeline and Bradley, not aggressively but almost protectively, as if he'd already decided which human in this equation deserved his loyalty. The white tiger's blue eyes fixed on Bradley with an expression that might have been challenge or might have been invitation, impossible to distinguish between the two. Madeline's voice emerged soft against the rain's steady percussion, explaining that she'd seen the open gate and followed instinct rather than logic, drawn by something she couldn't articulate in ways that would satisfy someone who lived by contracts and calculated risks. Her grandmother had taught her to trust feelings that moved through her body like electricity, sensations that preceded thought, and often proved more reliable than rational analysis. Bradley listened without interrupting, his mind cataloging details about her speech patterns and body language, the way she maintained eye contact without aggression, and kept one hand resting lightly on Astraeus' shoulder, as if drawing strength from the contact. She spoke about her grandmother's stories with a reverence that suggested genuine belief rather than nostalgic attachment to childhood fairy tales. Most people would have dismissed such explanations as superstitious nonsense, but Bradley had spent 5 years watching Astraeus defy every attempt at conventional understanding. The security team finally noticed the open enclosure door on their monitors, and Bradley's phone vibrated in his pocket with incoming alerts that he ignored completely. Protocols demanded immediate response to any breach of Astraeus' territory, yet here stood the breach itself, looking entirely unthreatening while the supposedly dangerous animal acted like a house cat seeking affection. Bradley made a mental note to review security footage later, to understand how someone had walked onto his property without triggering the sophisticated systems he'd paid a fortune to install. Astraeus shifted his position, moving to Madeline's side rather than standing between them, and his tail swept in a slow arc that scattered raindrops in patterns that caught the floodlights. The tiger's posture suggested he'd made some decision about the situation, determined that Bradley posed no immediate threat and could therefore be tolerated within visual range. It was more acceptance than the animal had shown toward any human besides Bradley himself, and even that relationship had been built on 5 years of careful distance and mutual respect for boundaries. The rain began to ease, transitioning from downpour to drizzle, and the sudden reduction in noise made the garden feel smaller, more intimate, as if the three of them existed inside a bubble that separated this moment from the ordinary flow of time. Bradley found himself taking a step closer to the enclosure's entrance, testing boundaries he'd maintained since Astraeus' arrival. The tiger watched, but didn't react with aggression, and Bradley interpreted this as permission to continue, to cross the threshold he'd commissioned, but never personally violated. His foot touched the enclosure's interior ground, expensive leather shoes making contact with earth that had been Astraeus' exclusive domain for half a decade. The tiger's ears swiveled forward, tracking the movement, but his body remained relaxed against Madeline's side. Bradley took another step, then another, aware that he was probably making the most dangerous decision of his life, but unable to stop himself from approaching the impossible scene that had rewritten every rule he'd established. Madeline watched him advance with an expression that suggested curiosity rather than fear, as if she understood that whatever happened next would reshape more than just this single evening. Her hand continued its slow movement through Astraeus' fur, maintaining the connection that seemed to ground all three of them in this strange new configuration. The wet strands of her dark hair framed a face that carried exhaustion around the eyes, but determination in the set of her jaw, contradictions that made Bradley wonder what circumstances had brought her walking through rain toward a mansion she had no business approaching. He stopped 5 feet from where they stood, close enough to see the intricate patterns in Astraeus' fur, the way white darkened to cream along his spine, the individual whiskers that framed his massive face. The tiger's blue eyes fixed on Bradley with an intensity that still carried warning despite the apparent calm, a reminder that acceptance could be revoked faster than human reflexes could respond. Yet something in that gaze also held recognition, acknowledgement that Bradley had finally crossed into territory he'd only observed from safe distances, finally committed to direct engagement rather than passive observation. The scent of wet jasmine drifted through the enclosure from plants Bradley had specifically chosen because they bloomed in rain, releasing fragrance that transformed storms into something almost sacred. Madeline breathed deeply, and Bradley saw her shoulders relax slightly, tension draining in response to sense that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to some older part of human consciousness. He'd installed those plants for aesthetic reasons, never imagining they might serve as olfactory bridges between strangers meeting under circumstances that defied conventional explanation. Astraeus made a sound low in his chest, not quite a growl, but carrying enough vibration to make Bradley feel it in his bones. The tiger lifted one massive paw and placed it on the ground between them, claws extending briefly before retracting, a gesture that might have been territorial claim or invitation depending on interpretation. Madeline's hand stilled on the tiger's shoulder, and her eyes met Bradley's with a question she didn't voice aloud, waiting for him to make the next move in this unscripted negotiation. Bradley crouched slowly, lowering his center of gravity to appear less threatening, a position that felt vulnerable in ways his usual standing authority never permitted. From this angle, Astraeus looked even more massive, a creature designed by evolution to dominate apex spaces and extract submission from anything that crossed his path. Yet the tiger's gaze held something beyond simple predatory assessment, intelligence that Bradley had always suspected but never confirmed until now, when distance had collapsed and pretense became impossible to maintain. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by diminishing rain and Astraeus' steady breathing, time stretching in ways that made Bradley lose track of how long they'd been frozen in this configuration. His legs began to ache from the crouch, but he maintained the position because standing might disrupt whatever fragile understanding had formed. Madeline shifted her weight, and Astraeus' head turned toward her immediately, seeking reassurance that her movement didn't signal departure or distress. She smiled, and it transformed her face from merely young to genuinely beautiful, the kind of beauty that had nothing to do with symmetry or fashion and everything to do with unguarded expression of emotion. Bradley felt something catch in his chest, an awareness that slipped past his usual defenses and lodged somewhere dangerous. He'd built his life on controlled transactions and calculated distances, relationships that served purposes and ended cleanly when those purposes concluded. Yet this stranger with her wet clothes and impossible connection to his tiger threatened all those carefully maintained boundaries. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the moment's spell, security personnel finally responding to alerts that had been ignored too long. Bradley stood in a single fluid motion, authority reasserting itself as he turned toward the enclosure entrance where his head of security appeared with hand on weapon and confusion written across his face. The man's eyes moved from Bradley to Madeline to Astraeus and back again, trying to construct a narrative that made sense of the scene, but clearly failing to find one that fit observable facts. Bradley raised one hand in a gesture that meant stand down, remain silent, wait for explanation, a signal his security team had learned to obey without question. The head of security's hand moved away from his weapon, but his posture remained tense, poised to intervene if the situation deteriorated in ways that required immediate action. Behind him, 2 other guards maintained position just outside the enclosure, their faces reflecting the same confusion their supervisor struggled to hide beneath professional composure. Astraeus released a rumbling sound that carried clear warning, his blue eyes fixing on the new arrivals with an intensity that made all 3 security personnel take involuntary steps backward. The tiger's body tensed, muscles coiling in preparation for movement that could cross the distance between them in seconds if he decided these newcomers represented threats requiring elimination. Madeline's hand pressed more firmly against his shoulder, and she murmured something too quiet for anyone else to hear, sounds that might have been words or might have been something older than language. The tiger's tension eased fractionally, enough for Bradley to breathe again, enough for security personnel to stop calculating their odds of survival if the situation went catastrophically wrong. Bradley gestured for them to retreat, to return to their posts and pretend the next 15 minutes hadn't happened, to demonstrate the selective blindness that successful employees in his organization learned to cultivate. They withdrew with visible relief, leaving Bradley alone again with Madeline and Astraeus in the enclosure that had suddenly become the most important room on his entire property. The rain stopped completely, and overhead clouds began to break apart, revealing patches of night sky where stars burned with cold light that predated human civilization by billions of years. Bradley looked up at those stars, then back at Madeline, then at Astraeus, trying to understand how 3 separate elements had combined to create this moment that felt simultaneously random and inevitable. The tiger settled back into his previous relaxed posture, apparently satisfied that the threat had passed and normal operations could resume. Madeline spoke first, asking if she should leave, if her presence had caused problems that would reverberate beyond this single evening. Her voice carried genuine concern rather than performative apology, an authentic inquiry about consequences rather than a rehearsed social script. Bradley found himself shaking his head before fully processing the question, an instinctive rejection of her departure that surprised him with its immediacy and intensity. He suggested she come inside, dry off, accept tea or coffee or something stronger if she preferred, offers that spilled out in a rush that completely abandoned his usual measured cadence. Madeline's eyebrows rose slightly, and Bradley realized how his invitation might sound, how it could be interpreted as something transactional or predatory, when he'd meant it as simple hospitality extended to someone who just experienced something extraordinary. He clarified quickly, explaining about guest rooms and staff who could provide dry clothes, making it clear she could leave whenever she wanted without obligation or expectation. Madeline accepted the invitation with a nod that suggested trust Bradley wasn't certain he'd earned, following him toward the mansion while Astraeus watched their departure with eyes that tracked every step. The tiger made no move to follow or protest, seemingly content to let his new acquaintance leave his territory as long as she did so voluntarily. Bradley glanced back once and saw the white tiger settling beneath his favorite maple, water dripping from branches overhead while the animal's blue eyes continued to glow in the darkness like distant stars brought impossibly close to Earth. The mansion's interior felt too warm after the rain's cold embrace, air conditioning that had seemed perfect an hour ago now, registering as stifling against Bradley's damp skin. He led Madeline through halls decorated with art that cost more than most houses, past furniture selected by designers who specialized in translating wealth into aesthetic statements. She walked without gawking or showing signs of intimidation, just observed her surroundings with the same calm she'd displayed approaching Astraeus, as if extraordinary spaces were simply locations, rather than statements about power and social hierarchy. A housekeeper appeared from a side corridor, professionalism overriding surprise at seeing her employer escorting a soaked stranger through the main house at nearly midnight. Bradley requested dry clothes, towels, and tea, prepared in the small sitting room adjacent to his study, orders delivered in the tone that made staff move efficiently without appearing rushed. The housekeeper disappeared with a brief nod, and Bradley continued guiding Madeline through the mansion toward spaces where they could talk, without interruption or observation from curious employees. The sitting room occupied a corner of the second floor, with windows that overlooked the gardens, and, distantly, Astraeus' enclosure. Bradley had chosen this room for its privacy and sightlines, a space where he could observe his property while discussing matters that required discretion. He gestured for Madeline to sit on a leather sofa that had been custom-made by craftsmen who worked exclusively for clients willing to pay premium prices for furniture that would last generations. She sank into the cushions with a sigh that suggested exhaustion had been building for hours or perhaps days, fatigue that rain and extraordinary circumstances had temporarily overridden, but could no longer be denied. Her eyes closed briefly, and Bradley saw the dark circles that exhaustion had painted beneath them, evidence of sleep deprivation or stress or both. When she opened her eyes again, they focused on him with renewed alertness, a conscious effort to remain present despite her body's obvious need for rest. The housekeeper returned with remarkable speed, carrying folded clothes that would probably fit reasonably well, and towels that were thick enough to provide comfort beyond simple functionality. She placed everything on a side table, poured tea into porcelain cups that had been in Bradley's family for 3 generations, and withdrew, without speaking, beyond the briefest acknowledgement of his thanks. Madeline wrapped her hands around the offered cup, absorbing warmth that seemed to reach deeper than just chilled fingers, breathing in steam that carried hints of bergamot and honey. Bradley took his own cup but didn't drink, using it as a prop for his hands while his mind worked through questions that had been accumulating since he'd first seen her in Astraeus's enclosure. He asked how she'd known the gesture that calmed the tiger, what tradition or training had taught her to approach dangerous animals with techniques that professional handlers didn't recognize. Madeline sipped her tea before answering, gathering thoughts or perhaps deciding how much truth to share with someone who was essentially a stranger, despite the intimacy of their recent shared experience. Her grandmother had been born in a region where old practices survived longer than they had in urbanized areas, knowledge passed down through generations who'd lived closer to wilderness and its inhabitants. The gesture she'd performed wasn't something that could be taught through instruction manuals or academic study, but rather understanding transmitted through demonstration and practice, and stories that embedded technique within narrative structure. She'd learned it as a child, practicing on neighborhood dogs and stray cats, never imagining she'd one day use it to calm a white tiger in a mansion garden while rain fell, and the world narrowed to just 2 heartbeats synchronized across species boundaries. Bradley listened with an attention he rarely gave to anything beyond business matters, absorbing not just her words, but the rhythm of her speech, and the pauses where memory clearly carried weight. She talked about her grandmother's death 2 years earlier, how the old woman had made her promise to trust the knowledge she'd received even when it seemed impractical or superstitious. That promise had been easy to make, and hard to keep in a world that rewarded rational thinking, and dismissed anything that couldn't be measured or replicated through controlled methodology. The conversation flowed into unexpected territory, moving from tigers and traditions to broader questions about what made life meaningful beyond simple survival. Madeline spoke about working multiple jobs that paid barely enough to cover rent in a shared apartment, exhaustion that had become so normal she'd almost forgotten what rested energy felt like. Yet, despite poverty that would have crushed many people's spirits, she maintained a curiosity about the world that manifested in observations about beauty she encountered during bus rides and walks through neighborhoods most of Bradley's associates would never voluntarily visit. Bradley found himself talking about his daughter, something he rarely did with anyone outside his immediate family circle, describing how 3-year-old curiosity made her ask questions he had no adequate answers for. She wanted to know why people couldn't just share everything so nobody went hungry, why some kids had toys that filled entire rooms, while others had nothing, why her father worked such long hours if he already had more money than they could spend. These questions came from a place of innocent confusion about systems adults had learned to accept as inevitable, and Bradley had discovered that explaining economic reality to a toddler forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about choices he'd made and continued making. Madeline smiled at his description of his daughter's interrogations, recognizing the particular frustration of trying to justify unjustifiable systems to someone who hadn't yet learned to accept contradictions as normal. She asked what he told his daughter when those questions came, whether he defaulted to simplified explanations that protected her from complexity, or tried to offer honest acknowledgement that the world operated according to rules that prioritize some people's comfort over others' survival. Bradley admitted he mostly deflected, promising to explain when she was older, knowing that age would teach her to stop asking questions that had no satisfying answers. They talked until the tea grew cold, and the housekeeper returned to refresh cups and leave a tray of food that neither of them touched. The conversation had shifted from personal history to philosophical questions about obligation and choice, about whether people with resources bore responsibility for those without, or whether everyone simply navigated the world according to their own best interests. Madeline argued for interconnection, suggesting that genuine security couldn't exist in societies where poverty and wealth existed in such extreme proximity, while Bradley countered with pragmatic observations about human nature's tendency toward self-preservation over collective welfare. The debate remained respectful, despite fundamental disagreements, both of them recognizing that their different perspectives stemmed from different lived experiences, rather than moral failures on either side. Madeline had seen poverty from inside its grinding daily reality, while Bradley had inherited wealth that insulated him from ever experiencing genuine material deprivation. Neither could fully understand the other's position, because understanding required experience that couldn't be transmitted through conversation alone, yet the attempt to bridge that gap created unexpected connection. Hours passed without either of them noticing, darkness outside the windows gradually giving way to pre-dawn gray that suggested morning approached faster than seemed possible. Bradley glanced at his watch and felt surprised that they'd been talking for nearly 4 hours, time that had compressed in ways he'd rarely experienced. Madeline noticed his gesture and asked if she should leave, awareness dawning that she'd occupied his attention far longer than politeness probably permitted. Bradley shook his head, explaining that sleep had become optional years ago, his schedule so irregular that traditional concepts of bedtime had ceased to have meaning. He suggested she might want to rest in one of the guest rooms, pointing out that exhaustion had painted her features with shadows that conversation couldn't fully disguise. Madeline hesitated, clearly torn between accepting hospitality and maintaining whatever independence poverty had taught her to prioritize above comfort. The decision was interrupted by sounds from downstairs, his daughter's voice calling for him with the particular insistence that meant she'd woken from a nightmare and needed reassurance that the world remained stable. Bradley excused himself and descended the stairs, finding his daughter on the landing with her favorite stuffed animal clutched against her chest and tears still wet on her cheeks. He lifted her into his arms, murmuring comfort, while she explained through hiccuping sobs about monsters that had chased her through dream landscapes where nothing made sense. He carried her back upstairs, intending to return her to her room, but she clung tighter and asked to stay with him until the fear faded completely. Bradley agreed, settling her on the sitting room sofa where Madeline still waited, introducing them with simple explanation that his daughter had needed comfort after a bad dream. The child's tears stopped as curiosity replaced fear, her attention fixing on Madeline with the unfiltered interest that children directed toward anything new and potentially fascinating. Madeline spoke to her with easy warmth, asking about the stuffed animal and listening to the earnest explanation of its name and history and importance in the household hierarchy. The conversation flowed naturally into a story Madeline began telling about a white tiger who lived in a garden full of flowers that bloomed at night, a tale that clearly drew from recent events, but transformed them into narrative that made magic seem possible, rather than frightening. Bradley's daughter listened with rapt attention, her body gradually relaxing against Madeline's side, as the story wove protective enchantment around her imagination. By the time the story concluded, his daughter had fallen asleep with her head resting on Madeline's lap, breathing steady and peaceful in ways that suggested nightmares had been thoroughly banished. Madeline looked up at Bradley with an expression that mixed tenderness with uncertainty, clearly unsure whether she should move and risk waking the sleeping child. Bradley settled into the chair across from them, content to let the moment extend, watching dawn light gradually fill the room while his daughter slept, and the woman who'd calmed his tiger sat perfectly still to avoid disturbing a child's hard-won peace. The next evening arrived with clear skies and temperatures that made the previous night's rain feel like something imagined rather than experienced. Bradley found himself watching the enclosure from his study window with more attention than usual, aware he was looking for Madeline despite having no reason to expect her return. She'd left that morning after his daughter woke, accepting a car service he'd arranged, but declining his offer to have her belongings retrieved from wherever she'd been staying. The departure had felt incomplete, a conversation paused mid-sentence rather than properly concluded. His phone buzzed with messages about shipments that needed approval and meetings that required his presence, but Bradley ignored them with unusual disregard for business matters that normally commanded immediate attention. His focus kept returning to the garden where Astraeus paced his territory, the tiger's movements carrying restless energy that suggested he also felt something incomplete about the previous night's events. Animals didn't experience human emotions, Bradley reminded himself, yet the tiger's behavior seemed to contradict that rational assessment in ways that made comfortable certainty harder to maintain. Movement at the estate's gates caught his attention, security cameras showing a familiar figure approaching on foot, despite the distance from any residential areas that would explain a casual evening walk. Madeline wore different clothes, but the same calm expression, moving up the driveway as if she'd been invited rather than arriving unannounced for the second consecutive night. Bradley watched her progress through multiple camera angles, tracking her path across his property, while his pulse accelerated in ways that had nothing to do with security concerns, and everything to do with anticipation he hadn't expected to feel. She walked directly to Astrias's enclosure, and the tiger responded to her presence before she'd even reached the door, standing and moving to the entrance with an eagerness that completely contradicted his usual territorial aggression. The door opened at her touch, that same hidden mechanism yielding to pressure she'd somehow intuited during her first visit, and Astrias greeted her with a sound that rumbled through the garden like distant thunder. Madeline's hand found his head immediately, resuming the contact that had calmed him previously, and the tiger leaned into her touch with an abandon that made Bradley's chest tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. Bradley descended from his study without conscious decision, his feet carrying him through the mansion and out into gardens that had become a stage for interactions that rewrote every assumption he'd previously held. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine again, those same plants releasing fragrance that seemed to mark significant moments, as if the garden itself participated in events unfolding within its boundaries. He approached the enclosure more confidently than the previous night, remembering that Astrias had tolerated his presence once, and might do so again. Madeline turned as he neared, and her smile held warmth that suggested she'd been hoping he'd appear, rather than simply tolerating his intrusion. Astrias acknowledged Bradley with a brief glance, before returning his attention to Madeline, making clear where his primary loyalty resided but also indicating that Bradley's presence wouldn't be actively opposed. The three of them stood in configuration that was becoming familiar, a triangle of awareness where each point tracked the others while maintaining their own distinct perspectives and priorities. They talked while the sky darkened from blue to purple to black, conversation flowing more easily than it had the previous night, building on foundation they'd established during those hours in the sitting room. Bradley found himself sharing details about his business operations that he'd never discussed with anyone outside his inner circle, explaining how legitimate enterprises provided cover for activities that generated actual profit. Madeline listened without judgment or visible shock, as if she'd always understood that wealth like his couldn't be generated through entirely legal means and systems designed to concentrate resources among those who already controlled them. She talked about her jobs with a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of their futility, describing how no combination of hourly wages would ever generate enough income to escape the cycle that kept her trapped in poverty. The math simply didn't work unless something fundamental changed, yet changing anything fundamental required resources she'd never accessed through sanctioned pathways. Bradley heard the frustration beneath her calm recitation of facts, recognized the particular exhaustion that came from fighting systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of upward mobility they claimed to reward. Astrias settled between them, his massive body creating a physical bridge that connected two people who should have remained in completely separate worlds. The tiger's presence made their conversation feel protected somehow, as if his territory existed outside normal social rules and hierarchies that would otherwise have prevented genuine connection. Bradley found his hand reaching toward Astrias's fur, hesitating before making contact, aware that this boundary had never been crossed, and might still carry consequences his previous visit had simply postponed rather than eliminated. Madeline noticed his hesitation and spoke quietly to Astrias, words Bradley couldn't quite hear, but that made the tiger's ears swivel toward her. The animal shifted slightly, angling his body to make his shoulder more accessible, and Bradley understood this as invitation offered through Madeline's intercession. His palm touched white fur that felt coarser than it looked, warm from retained body heat, alive in ways that made abstract knowledge of Astrias's physical presence transform into visceral reality that bypassed rational thought entirely. The three of them remained there, while stars emerged overhead, a constellation of awareness, where each member served essential function in maintaining the whole. Bradley felt something shift inside his chest, a rearrangement of priorities that had been slowly occurring since the previous night, but now solidified into conscious recognition. Madeline represented everything his world usually excluded, yet her presence had revealed gaps in existence he'd built around himself, spaces that wealth and power couldn't adequately fill no matter how much of either he accumulated. His daughter appeared at the mansion's rear entrance, her nanny trailing behind with apologetic expression that suggested the child had insisted on this evening excursion, despite bedtime protocols. She ran across the lawn with 3-year-old abandon, heading directly for the enclosure where she'd been told never to approach. Bradley moved to intercept her, but Madeline's hand on his arm stopped him, her head shaking slightly in gesture that suggested trust rather than intervention. The child reached the enclosure and pressed her face against the bars, calling to Astraeus with the unself-conscious confidence of someone too young to have learned proper fear. The tiger turned toward her, and Bradley's entire body tensed, prepared to act despite knowing he'd never move fast enough if Astraeus decided to treat his daughter as prey. But the white tiger simply approached the bars and lowered his head, bringing his face level with the child's, separated only by steel that suddenly seemed inadequate protection against catastrophic possibilities. His daughter reached through the bars before Bradley could stop her, her small hand touching Astraeus' nose while she laughed with pure delight. The tiger's eyes closed briefly, accepting the contact with the same patient tolerance he'd shown Madeline, and Bradley felt fear transform into something close to wonder. His daughter withdrew her hand and turned to him, announcing that the pretty white cat liked her, that she could tell because he'd made a happy sound when she touched him. Madeline crouched beside his daughter, and they began talking about Astraeus in voices too quiet for Bradley to hear clearly, the child's animated gestures suggesting enthusiastic storytelling. The tiger watched them both with an expression that might have been contentment, his tail moving in slow arcs that contradicted everything Bradley had believed about the animal's temperament and capacity for social connection. The scene looked impossible, a configuration that violated every safety protocol and common sense assessment. Yet it was occurring with such natural ease that objecting would have felt absurd. Bradley's head of security appeared at the garden's edge, radio in hand, clearly responding to reports about the child's proximity to dangerous territory. Bradley waved him off with a gesture that meant stand down, everything's under control, trust what you're seeing even if it makes no sense. The security chief's face reflected profound confusion, but he retreated as ordered, leaving Bradley to manage a situation that definitely wasn't under control in any conventional meaning of the phrase, but somehow felt safer than most carefully planned operations he'd overseen. The evening extended into night, his daughter eventually falling asleep against Madeline's shoulder, while Astraeus dozed nearby, creating a tableau that would have seemed staged if Bradley hadn't witnessed its organic development. He stood apart from them, observer to a scene that included him, but didn't require his participation, watching three beings from completely different circumstances find unexpected harmony in a garden designed to contain violence that had somehow transformed into sanctuary for connection he'd never imagined possible. Madeline looked up at him, and her eyes held a question she didn't voice, an inquiry about whether this could continue, or whether tonight represented an aberration that morning would erase. Bradley found himself nodding, answering the unspoken question with commitment that probably exceeded wisdom, but felt more right than any decision he'd made in years. The cage door would remain open, he decided, both literally and metaphorically, allowing whatever was developing between them to unfold according to its own rhythm, rather than rules imposed by circumstances that suddenly seemed less relevant than they'd appeared just 48 hours earlier. His daughter stirred, and Madeline carefully shifted her position to avoid waking her, movements that spoke to experience with children despite her young age. Bradley moved to collect his daughter, lifting her into his arms where she settled without fully waking, secure in the familiar comfort of her father's presence. Madeline stood, and for a moment they faced each other across 3 feet of space that felt simultaneously vast and negligible, a distance that could be crossed in a single step, but represented a journey that would require more than physical movement. Bradley suggested she stay, not in a guest room this time, but in spaces closer to where his daughter slept, rooms that would position her as something more than visitor, but less than he could yet define. Madeline's acceptance came without hesitation, and he recognized that she'd been hoping for exactly this invitation, waiting to see if he'd offer what she'd been too uncertain to request. They walked back to the mansion together, Astraeus watching from his enclosure with eyes that caught starlight, and held it, the white tiger serving as witness to the beginning of something that would change all 3 of their lives in ways none of them could yet fully comprehend. Madeline's presence in the mansion transformed the household's rhythm in ways that became apparent gradually, rather than through dramatic disruption. She moved through the space with careful attention to boundaries, understanding that her position remained undefined, and therefore required navigation according to instincts rather than established protocols. Staff members watched her with curiosity that bordered on suspicion, trying to determine whether she represented temporary anomaly or permanent fixture in their employer's increasingly unpredictable life. Bradley's daughter attached herself to Madeline with the immediate devotion that children showed toward people who genuinely listened, rather than simply tolerating their endless questions. Morning routines now included the child dragging Madeline to the breakfast table, insisting she sit beside her while Bradley read reports and drank coffee that had gone cold before he remembered to drink it. The nanny hovered nearby with barely concealed relief at having assistance with a 3-year-old whose energy seemed limitless. The enclosure became their evening destination, all 3 of them drawn to Astreas's territory, as if the tiger's garden offered something the mansion's expensive rooms couldn't provide. The white tiger greeted them with sounds that ranged from rumbling purrs to sharp chuffs, vocalizations that seemed specifically tailored to whoever approached first. He'd developed distinct responses for each of them, a sophistication in his social behavior that contradicted everything Bradley's handlers had previously claimed about the species' capacity for nuanced interaction. Bradley found himself spending less time in his study and more time in spaces where Madeline and his daughter created their own small ecosystem of stories and games. He'd watch them from doorways, hesitant to intrude on moments that seemed complete without his participation, yet feeling drawn toward the warmth they generated simply by existing in proximity to each other. His daughter would sometimes notice him and call him over, insisting he join whatever activity they'd invented, and he'd find himself on the floor playing games whose rules changed every 3 minutes. Madeline asked questions about his work with a directness that most people avoided, understanding that knowledge was power, and ignorance left her vulnerable in an environment where everyone else knew more than she did. Bradley answered with unusual honesty, explaining operations and relationships that formed the infrastructure of his organization. She absorbed information without visible judgment, processing details about money laundering and territory negotiations as if he were describing entirely legal business practices. The conversations revealed Madeline's intelligence in ways that formal education couldn't have developed, a strategic thinking that came from navigating poverty's constant calculations about resource allocation and risk assessment. She saw patterns in his business descriptions that some of his paid consultants missed, pointing out vulnerabilities in supply chains and suggesting alternatives that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of complex systems. Bradley found himself taking notes during their discussions, recognizing that her perspective offered value beyond simple companionship. His business associates noticed changes in his behavior during meetings that now felt like interruptions rather than priority engagements. He'd check his phone more frequently, impatient for conversations to conclude so he could return to the mansion where something more interesting than profit margins waited for his attention. Longtime partners exchanged glances that communicated concern about their boss's shifting focus, aware that distraction in their line of work often preceded catastrophic mistakes. The head of security requested a private meeting, his expression carrying the weight of concerns he'd been accumulating since the night Madeline first appeared. He spoke carefully, acknowledging that Bradley's personal life remained his own business, while also pointing out that unknown variables created vulnerabilities in security protocols designed to protect both the household and the organization's operations. Background checks had revealed limited information about Madeline, just a trail of minimum wage employment and residential addresses in neighborhoods where people learned not to attract official attention. Bradley listened without interruption, understanding that his security chief was doing exactly what he was paid to do, while also resenting the implication that Madeline represented a threat requiring management. He explained that some risks were worth taking, that not everything valuable could be assessed through background checks and threat assessments. The security chief's face showed skepticism, but professional acceptance, nodding acknowledgement that his concerns had been heard, even if they hadn't resulted in the action he'd hoped to prompt. Astreas's transformation became a topic of fascinated discussion among household staff who'd spent years avoiding the enclosure and now witnessed their employer's daughter playing near the tiger without apparent danger. The animal handler who delivered meat 3 times weekly expressed amazement at behavioral changes that contradicted everything his 2 decades of experience had taught him about apex predators. He'd watch Astreas interact with the small family group and shake his head, muttering about phenomena that belonged in academic journals rather than private estates. The tiger had begun allowing Bradley's daughter to enter the enclosure under Madeline's supervision, a development that should have terrified Bradley, but instead filled him with strange peace. He'd watch his daughter toddle through Astreas's garden while the massive white tiger paced alongside her like an enormous guard dog, protective rather than predatory. The child would grab handfuls of white fur without fear, and Astreas would simply adjust his gait to accommodate her unsteady movements, patient in ways that seemed impossible for an animal who'd spent 5 years rejecting all human contact. Madeline spent hours in the enclosure even when Bradley and his daughter were elsewhere, sitting beneath the Japanese maple while Astreas rested with his head in her lap. She'd read books borrowed from Bradley's library, occasionally reading passages aloud to the tiger, who seemed to listen with genuine attention. Staff members who glimpsed these scenes through windows reported them with the tone people used when describing miracles, events that violated natural law but were nonetheless occurring with undeniable regularity. The household developed new rhythms around Madeline's presence, schedules adjusting to accommodate someone who existed outside the formal hierarchy, but clearly held significant influence. The cook began preparing meals that included vegetarian options after noticing Madeline's dietary preferences, and the housekeeper ensured fresh flowers appeared in rooms where Madeline spent time. These small accommodations accumulated into acknowledgement that she'd become integral to the household's functioning, regardless of her undefined official status. Bradley's business required a 3-day trip to another city for negotiations that couldn't be conducted remotely, meetings with associates who insisted on face-to-face interaction for matters involving substantial territory and financial adjustments. He'd made such trips dozens of times without concern, but departure this time felt different, weighted with reluctance that had nothing to do with the negotiations themselves. His daughter cried when he explained he'd be gone for several days, clinging to him with the desperate grip of someone who'd learned that absence sometimes became permanent. Madeline promised to stay with his daughter while he traveled, an offer that provided comfort to the child, an unexpected relief to Bradley himself. He'd never left his daughter in anyone's care besides the nanny and trusted household staff, yet he found himself grateful for Madeline's presence in ways that went beyond practical childcare logistics. She represented stability that had nothing to do with money or power, a grounding influence that made the mansion feel more like home than it had since his wife had died giving birth to their daughter. The farewell occurred in the enclosure, where all significant moments now seemed to take place, Astraeus watching while Bradley's daughter hugged him with 3-year-old intensity that made his chest ache. Madeline stood nearby with one hand resting on the tiger's shoulder, and Bradley found his gaze moving between his daughter and Madeline and Astraeus, a triangle of connection that had become essential to his sense of equilibrium. He'd built an empire through strategic thinking and calculated risks, yet this small constellation of beings represented wealth that couldn't be quantified in financial terms. His daughter finally released him and ran to Madeline, seeking comfort for the distress of temporary separation, and Bradley watched Madeline scoop her up with easy affection that had developed over just a few weeks. The two of them waved as he walked toward the waiting car, his daughter calling that he needed to come back soon because they'd planned stories to tell him. Bradley waved back, and for the first time in years, departure felt like loss rather than relief from domestic obligations that had always seemed secondary to business priorities. The 3 days away felt longer than previous trips that had lasted weeks, hours stretching in ways that made Bradley check his phone constantly for updates that Madeline sent without being asked. Photos of his daughter playing in the gardens, videos of Astraeus responding to commands Bradley hadn't known the tiger understood, brief text messages that conveyed normalcy, while somehow making him miss what he'd left behind. Business negotiations concluded successfully, territories were reallocated according to carefully structured agreements, yet Bradley found himself hurrying through final dinners and declining optional social events that would extend his absence. The return journey felt urgent in ways that had nothing to do with business concerns waiting at home, anticipation building as his car climbed the hillside toward the estate. Security gates opened, and he saw lights in the enclosure where evening had already fallen, 3 figures visible in the illuminated space. His daughter spotted the car and began jumping with excitement, and Madeline stood beside her with a smile that suggested she'd been counting hours as carefully as he had. Astraeus approached the enclosure fence as Bradley exited the car, the tiger's blue eyes reflecting light in ways that made them seem to glow with internal fire. Bradley walked directly to the enclosure, bypassing the mansion entirely, drawn toward the space that had become the center of everything that mattered. His daughter launched herself at him through the open gate, chattering about everything that had happened during his absence, words tumbling over each other too fast for coherent narrative, but conveying enthusiasm that needed no translation. Madeline waited her turn, and when his daughter finally paused for breath, Bradley found himself standing close enough to see flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Words he'd been rehearsing during the drive home dissolved, inadequate for expressing what her presence had come to mean in such impossibly short time. She spoke first, saying simply that they'd missed him, and Bradley realized that they encompassed not just his daughter, but also Madeline herself, and possibly even Astraeus, a collective that had formed during his absence, and now welcomed his return to its fold. The threat arrived through channels designed to remain invisible to people who weren't actively watching for them. Warnings from associates who'd picked up intelligence about rival organizations discussing Bradley's apparent vulnerabilities. His distraction hadn't gone unnoticed in circles where any weakness became opportunity for ambitious competitors willing to risk violent confrontation for territorial gain. The messages carried urgency that Bradley recognized as genuine rather than manufactured concern, credible dangers that required immediate attention and strategic response. Bradley's study became war room as he gathered his inner circle to assess the situation. Maps and financial documents spread across surfaces, while phones buzzed with incoming updates. The rival organization had been testing boundaries for months, small incursions that Bradley had dismissed as posturing rather than serious challenge to his authority. That dismissal now appeared to have been strategic miscalculation, based on assumptions that his reputation alone would deter aggressive expansion, assumptions that his recent distraction had apparently invalidated in their risk assessments. His security chief outlined the threat with military precision, identifying vulnerable points in operations and recommending immediate defensive measures that would signal renewed focus and capacity for violent response if necessary. The recommendations made tactical sense, proven strategies that had worked in previous territorial disputes, yet implementing them would require Bradley's complete attention for weeks or potentially months. That attention would mean less time at the mansion, fewer evenings in the enclosure, reduced presence in his daughter's daily life and separation from Madeline, during a period when their relationship remained undefined and therefore fragile. Madeline appeared in the doorway of the study, despite having been told the meeting was confidential, her expression carrying determination that made Bradley's security chief reach instinctively toward his weapon before recognizing her. She apologized for the interruption, but said she'd overheard enough to understand the situation's basic parameters, and she had thoughts that might prove useful if Bradley was willing to listen to someone with no formal training in organizational warfare. The security chief's face showed skepticism that bordered on contempt, but Bradley gestured for her to continue, curious about what perspective she might offer. She spoke about patterns she'd noticed in their previous conversations about his business operations, vulnerabilities she'd identified that Bradley had dismissed as theoretical rather than immediate concerns. Those same vulnerabilities now appeared to be exactly what his rivals planned to exploit, suggesting they'd conducted more thorough analysis than Bradley's team had credited them with. Madeline outlined a defensive strategy that protected critical infrastructure while appearing to leave openings that would actually function as traps for anyone stupid enough to press their advantage into what looked like undefended territory. The room fell silent as Bradley's inner circle processed suggestions from someone they'd previously dismissed as their boss's temporary distraction, recognition dawning that her analysis demonstrated sophisticated understanding of strategic thinking. The security chief asked pointed questions that Madeline answered with confidence, revealing that she'd been paying closer attention to Bradley's business discussions than anyone had realized. Her suggestions weren't just theoretically sound, but practically implementable with resources and personnel Bradley already controlled, requiring coordination rather than additional investment. Bradley found himself reassessing everything he'd assumed about Madeline's role in his life, understanding that she'd been offering value he'd been too distracted to fully recognize. Their evening conversations hadn't been simple entertainment or romantic prelude, but actual strategic consultations, where her outsider perspective identified blind spots his experienced advisors couldn't see because they were too embedded in the organization's established thinking. She'd been analyzing his empire while appearing to just listen, building understanding that she'd apparently been waiting for the right moment to deploy. The meeting continued with Madeline's participation, the initial plan modified to incorporate her suggestions until the final strategy bore significant imprint of her thinking. Bradley's associates exchanged glances that communicated surprise and grudging respect, recalibrating their assessments of someone they'd underestimated based on superficial characteristics. The security chief acknowledged that her approach might actually work better than his original recommendations, admission that clearly cost him professional pride but demonstrated capacity to prioritize results over ego. Implementation began immediately, orders flowing through encrypted channels to personnel who'd been on standby waiting for direction. The defensive measures would require Bradley's oversight, but not his constant presence, a crucial distinction that meant he wouldn't need to abandon his household for the field operations that had previously consumed his attention during territorial disputes. He could coordinate from the study while maintaining the evening routines that had become essential to his sense of equilibrium, present for his daughter and Madeline, and even Astreus, while still managing the crisis that threatened everything he'd built. The rivals made their move 3 days later, probing attacks on supply routes that should have been vulnerable but had been reinforced according to Madeline's strategic suggestions. The attacks failed spectacularly, resulting in significant losses for the rival organization, while Bradley's operations continued without disruption. Intelligence reports indicated confusion among the rivals about how their carefully researched vulnerabilities had transformed into hardened positions, their strategic advantage evaporating faster than they could adjust their approach. Bradley watched the situation unfold through status reports that arrived hourly, satisfaction building as Madeline's strategy proved more effective than even she'd predicted. The rivals had committed resources based on assumptions that turned out to be catastrophically wrong, weakening their position while strengthening Bradley's reputation for anticipating threats before they fully materialized. His associates began referring to the defensive strategy with approval that bordered on admiration, though they carefully avoided mentioning that the approach had originated with someone outside their professional hierarchy. The crisis peaked and began to recede within 2 weeks, faster resolution than anyone had anticipated when the threat first emerged. The rival organization sued for negotiated settlement, rather than continue operations that were costing them more than any potential territorial gain could justify. Bradley's team drafted terms that were generous enough to allow the rivals to save face while still establishing clear boundaries that wouldn't be tested again without serious reconsideration of likely consequences. Madeline watched the resolution unfold from the margins, never claiming credit for her contributions, but clearly tracking outcomes with satisfaction that suggested she understood exactly what her strategic thinking had accomplished. Bradley's daughter remained oblivious to the crisis that had threatened to consume her father's attention, her daily routines continuing without disruption, because the threat had been managed efficiently enough not to require the kind of total commitment previous territorial disputes had demanded. The evening the settlement was finalized, Bradley found Madeline in the enclosure with Astreus, reading aloud from a book of poetry while the white tiger dozed with his head resting near her feet. The scene looked peaceful in ways that completely contradicted the violence that had been averted through her strategic intervention, domestic tranquility that existed, because she'd helped eliminate threats that might have shattered it. Bradley stood at the enclosure entrance, watching for several minutes before she noticed his presence, and looked up with a question in her eyes. He entered without hesitation, crossing the threshold that had become familiar territory over the past weeks, and settled on the ground beside her, while Astreus opened one blue eye to acknowledge his arrival, before returning to apparent sleep. Bradley explained the settlement's final terms, giving her full credit for the strategy that had proven more effective than anything his experienced team had suggested. Madeline accepted the acknowledgement without false modesty, but also without claiming more credit than she'd earned, recognizing that implementation had required resources and authority she didn't possess. The conversation shifted from business to more personal territory, Bradley finally articulating what he'd been feeling since she first appeared in his tiger's enclosure. He explained that her presence had revealed emptiness in his life, that wealth and power had never adequately filled. Connections he'd convinced himself were unnecessary luxuries that successful people in his position learned to live without. She'd proven that assumption wrong simply by existing in his space, by engaging with his daughter and calming his tiger, and seeing patterns in his business that others missed. Madeline listened without interrupting, her hand resting on Astreus's side, in a gesture that had become habitual during their conversations. When Bradley finished, she spoke about her own reassessment of assumptions she'd held about people like him, acknowledgement that she'd arrived at his mansion with prejudices shaped by poverty's resentments toward wealth's indifference. He'd surprised her by being more than the stereotype she'd expected, by showing capacity for growth and genuine care beneath the controlled exterior his position required him to maintain. Astreus stirred and lifted his head, looking between them with an expression that might have been satisfaction, or might have been simple contentment with the current arrangement. The tiger had been the catalyst for everything that had developed between Bradley and Madeline, the impossible element that had brought two people from completely different worlds into proximity where connection could form, despite all the barriers that should have kept them apart. His territory had become the space where normal rules didn't apply, where wealth and poverty and power and vulnerability could coexist without the usual hierarchies that governed their interaction elsewhere. Bradley reached for Madeline's hand, a gesture that felt simultaneously momentous and entirely natural, given everything that had already passed between them. She didn't pull away, her fingers interlacing with his, while Astreus watched with his blue eyes reflecting the lights that illuminated the garden. The evening air carried jasmine scent again, that familiar fragrance marking another significant threshold crossed, another moment when the universe paused to acknowledge that something important was occurring in this carefully maintained space. His daughter's voice called from the mansion, announcing that bedtime was approaching, and she needed both Bradley and Madeline present for the elaborate ritual she'd constructed around going to sleep. They stood together, and Astraeus rose with them, the three of them moving toward the enclosure entrance in a configuration that had become as natural as breathing. The tiger stopped at the gate, watching them cross back into the human world while he remained in his kingdom, his role complete now that he'd brought them together and seen the connection solidify into something that might actually last. 3 months transformed the household in ways that would have seemed impossible during those first chaotic nights when Madeline had appeared like an answer to questions Bradley hadn't known he was asking. The mansion's rhythms had fully adjusted to include her as integral rather than temporary presence, staff members no longer questioning her authority when she made decisions about household matters or his daughter's daily schedule. She'd become the center around which multiple orbits revolved, providing stability that allowed everyone else to function more effectively in their respective roles. Bradley's daughter had started calling Madeline by a name that wasn't quite mother, but carried similar weight and affection. Syllables the child had invented that meant something closer to person who makes everything better. The nanny had gradually reduced her hours as Madeline assumed more of the daily childcare responsibilities, transition that occurred naturally rather than through formal negotiation. Mornings now began with the child climbing into Madeline's bed for stories before breakfast, routines that had established themselves through repetition until they felt like they'd always existed this way. The business operations had stabilized under the new defensive arrangements, Bradley's reputation enhanced rather than damaged by the recent crisis that had been resolved so efficiently. Associates who'd initially questioned his judgment about Madeline now sought her input during strategic planning sessions, recognizing that her perspective provided value they couldn't generate from within their own established thinking. She attended meetings in the study, contributing analysis that consistently identified opportunities and risks others missed, earning respect through demonstrated competence rather than relying on her relationship with Bradley. Astraeus's cage stood permanently open, the heavy door propped back in a position that made clear its security function had ended. The white tiger still spent most of his time in the enclosure's garden, preferring his established territory to the larger estate grounds, but he'd begun accompanying them on evening walks through the property. Neighbors who glimpsed a white tiger strolling across immaculate lawns beside a small child would later question whether they'd actually seen what they thought they'd seen, reality proving too strange for comfortable certainty about their own perceptions. The tiger's presence had become protective rather than aggressive, his massive body positioning itself between the household and any perceived threats with an alertness that made Bradley's security team nervous, despite understanding they now had the world's most effective early warning system. Delivery personnel learned to check whether Astraeus was visible before approaching the mansion, and those who forgot received gentle but unmistakable reminders that the white tiger took his guardianship seriously, even when appearing to doze in afternoon sun. Bradley found himself working fewer hours, as Madeline's strategic contributions allowed him to delegate more effectively, trusting his team to implement decisions, rather than micromanaging every detail personally. The time reclaimed went into his daughter's life, hours spent on the floor building elaborate structures from blocks that would immediately be destroyed so construction could begin again. He'd discovered that his daughter's games carried their own logic that made perfect sense once he stopped trying to impose adult expectations about purpose and outcome. Evening meals became the day's anchor point, the four of them gathering around the table while Astraeus dozed nearby, full from his own dinner, and content to participate through proximity rather than active engagement. Conversations ranged across topics that had nothing to do with business or survival, idle speculation about which stars were actually planets, and whether trees communicated through their roots the way his daughter insisted she'd read in a picture book. These discussions felt more valuable than the strategic planning sessions that had previously consumed his evenings, connection that existed for its own sake rather than serving instrumental purposes. Madeline had transformed the mansion's aesthetic through subtle changes that accumulated into significant shifts in atmosphere, introducing plants that thrived in the controlled interior climate, and rearranging furniture to create spaces that invited conversation, rather than impressing visitors with wealth's visual markers. The modifications made rooms feel inhabited rather than displayed, spaces where people actually lived instead of sets designed to communicate status. Staff members commented privately that the mansion finally felt like a home, acknowledgement that money alone had never been sufficient to create genuine domestic warmth. The question of Madeline's official status remained unresolved, neither of them particularly concerned with defining their relationship through conventional categories or legal structures. She lived in the mansion, participated in household decisions, contributed to business strategy, and functioned as mother figure to his daughter, despite having no formal authority or recognition. The ambiguity bothered Bradley's lawyers, who worried about estate planning and liability issues, but Bradley dismissed their concerns with unusual indifference to proper documentation and risk management. His daughter had begun asking when Madeline would officially become her mother, 3-year-old directness that cut through adult reluctance to name things that already existed in practice, if not in law. Bradley and Madeline had discussed the question during late-night conversations after his daughter was asleep, both of them aware that marriage would create complications alongside its benefits. Her background would become subject to scrutiny that might reveal things better left unexamined, while his business associations would require explanations about sudden domestic arrangements that appeared to violate his previously maintained boundaries. Yet the question persisted, growing more urgent as his daughter's requests became more frequent and insistent. She wanted Madeline to be permanent rather than potentially temporary. Security that could only come through formal recognition that satisfied a child's need for clear categories and defined relationships. Bradley found himself researching options that would provide legal protection without requiring the kind of public documentation that might create vulnerabilities for either Madeline or his business operations. The solution emerged through conversations with an attorney who specialized in confidential arrangements for clients whose lives required discretion beyond what standard legal structures provided. Private ceremonies could establish legal bonds without public records, protections that would satisfy his daughter's need for certainty, while maintaining the privacy that both Bradley and Madeline valued. The attorney drafted documents that recognized Madeline as his daughter's legal guardian, with full parental authority, first step toward more complete integration that could occur when circumstances permitted. Bradley presented the documents to Madeline in the enclosure where all their significant conversations seemed to happen. Astreus present as witness to another threshold being crossed. She read through the legal language carefully, understanding what was being offered and what questions were being left for later resolution. Her acceptance came without hesitation, acknowledgement that she'd already committed to the household and its members in ways that made formal documentation merely catching up to emotional reality. His daughter's reaction to the news was pure joy expressed through jumping, that made Astreus lift his head in alarm, before recognizing that the child's exuberance represented celebration rather than distress. She insisted on an immediate party to mark the occasion, 3-year-old certainty that important events required cake and decorations, even when adults might prefer quieter acknowledgement. The household staff scrambled to accommodate her demands, producing a celebration that evening that felt appropriately momentous despite its impromptu nature. The party occurred in the garden with Astreus lounging nearby, the white tiger's presence transforming a simple household celebration into something that felt mythical, as if ancient stories about humans and animals living in harmony had somehow become manifest in modern form. Staff members who'd initially questioned Madeline's place in the household now toasted her new status with genuine warmth, having witnessed how her presence had improved everyone's lives, including their own. Bradley watched his daughter dance with Madeline across grass that had been manicured to perfection, 2 figures moving without coordination, but perfect synchronization of joy. Astreus observed them with his blue eyes reflecting party lights strung through trees, the tiger's expression suggesting satisfaction with arrangements he'd somehow facilitated simply by being the catalyst that brought them all together. The evening felt complete, in ways that Bradley had never experienced. Wealth and power suddenly revealed as insufficient substitutes for the connections that actually made life meaningful. The guests gradually departed as night deepened, leaving just the 4 of them in the garden, where jasmine released its fragrance into air that had grown cool enough to require the sweaters Madeline had thought to bring. His daughter fell asleep against Bradley's shoulder, exhausted by excitement that had sustained her hours past her usual bedtime. Madeline leaned against his other side, and Astreus shifted closer until they formed a tight cluster under the stars that burned overhead with the same cold fire they'd shown for billions of years before humans existed and would continue showing long after humanity disappeared. Bradley understood in that moment that he'd been given something rare, a chance to build a life that integrated all the parts of himself, rather than compartmentalizing them into separate domains that never touched. His business would continue. His reputation would remain fearsome in circles where fear translated to respect, but those aspects of his existence would no longer define him completely. He'd become someone's father, not just biologically, but through daily engagement. Someone's partner not through legal contract, but through chosen commitment. Someone who'd learned that a white tiger could teach lessons about connection that no amount of money or power could buy. Madeline stirred, and suggested they move inside before his daughter caught cold, practical concern that grounded the moment's philosophical weight in immediate physical reality. They stood together, Bradley carrying his sleeping daughter, while Madeline walked beside him, and Astreus followed at a distance that suggested escort rather than pursuit. The tiger stopped at the mansion's entrance, his territory apparently not extending into human domestic spaces, watching as they crossed the threshold into warmth and light. Bradley looked back once before the door closed, seeing Astreus silhouetted against garden lights, the white tiger's form solid and real, rather than metaphorical, despite everything he'd come to represent. The animal had been the key that unlocked possibilities Bradley hadn't known existed, the impossible element that made everything else possible by virtue of being so completely outside normal categories and expectations. The cage that had once contained him stood empty now, door open to nothing, because Astreus had never needed physical barriers once he'd found what he'd been guarding all along. The future stretched ahead with uncertainty about details, but confidence about foundation. A household built on connections that had survived initial improbability to become more solid than structures built on conventional arrangements. Bradley carried his daughter upstairs, while Madeline prepared for the bedtime rituals that had become sacred in their elaborate specificity, routines that would continue tomorrow and the day after, and all the days that followed. The white tiger would be in his garden when morning came, patient and present and permanent, the impossible thing that had become the most reliable constant in all their lives. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing these stories to life. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most extraordinary connections happen when we're brave enough to cross the thresholds that everyone else fears to approach.